Here's a shocking truth. Medieval sex wasn't the prudish, church-controlled mess you probably picture. In fact, it was often raw, out in the open, and changed drastically depending on your social standing. Peasants had almost no privacy, making intimacy a near-public event, while nobles slipped behind fancy bed curtains for their secret affairs. Urban brothels were organized, even regulated, with sex workers sometimes sparking fashion trends. Imagine that contrast. Castles versus cottages, hidden whispers versus shared huts, ready to rethink everything you thought you knew about medieval desire. Let's break down some major myths next. So, let's get straight to shattering some myths about medieval sex. You've probably got this image of everyone back then being uptight, terrified of sin, and chained to church rules. But hold on. That's nowhere near the full picture. The truth is, what went on in private, or sometimes not so private, was a lot more open and messy than you'd think. It all hinged on who you were and where you lived, and that made for some serious surprises. First off, forget the idea that sex was always this shameful, hidden thing. In many spots, especially busy cities, it was right out there, accepted, and even structured with its own set of guidelines. Your place in society decided how much leeway you had. Nobles got to play their secretive romance games, whispering sweet nothings in tucked-away castle nooks. Meanwhile, peasants? They were squeezed into tiny huts with no privacy at all, getting close while a neighbor might be snoring just a flimsy wall away. That kind of split wasn't just a random detail. It defined how people experienced desire. Historical records show how much wealth changed the game. For nobles, heavy bed curtains and massive rooms offered a veil of discretion, though rumors still flew fast. Peasants didn't have that buffer. Old accounts describe one-room homes where everyone saw and heard everything. There was no escaping the gossip, whether it came from family or nosy villagers. Your status didn't just get you nicer stuff. It got you a barrier from constant prying eyes in your most unguarded moments. Picture strolling through a medieval city like York. Streets often got names tied to what was sold there. And, yeah, that included sex. Historical notes mention sex workers sporting bells or striped hoods, not to blend in, but to stand out as part of their trade. They weren't lurking in dark corners. They were as much a part of the city as any merchant. Some records even hint that their bold looks inspired trends among wealthier women. That's the kind of unexpected twist you wouldn't peg for a time we assume was so stiff. Here's a little nugget about the church's influence. Sure, they laid down harsh rules. No sex on certain days, holidays, or basically any time they could think up an excuse. It was supposed to be just for making babies, nothing more. But guess what? Most people, even some clergy, just ignored it. Old letters and court cases are packed with tales of priests, with lovers, and villagers breaking every rule in the book. Those fiery sermons didn't stick when real life came knocking. So, with class and location flipping the script on intimacy, how did people handle love and lust in such a split-up world? The reality of medieval sex wasn't some dull, universal code everyone obeyed. It was a crazy range of experiences, molded by your money and your home. What folks thought about getting close varied so wildly, it's like they were living on different planets. And if that's got you curious, just wait until we look at how those differences showed up right from the very first night of marriage. Let's zero in on that pivotal first night of marriage and see just how much your social rank changed the game. We're talking wedding nights here, and trust me, the gap between a castle chamber and a peasant cottage was as wide as it gets. Whether you were draped in silk or patched up wool, this moment carried serious weight, but the way it unfolded couldn't have been more different. Start with the nobles, where the wedding night was practically a theater production. Picture a grand bed in a stone-walled chamber, something like King Edward I's setup in the Tower of London from around 1280, built to carve out a sliver of privacy. Before the couple even got near it, a priest would bless the bed, sanctifying the whole deal while guests looked on. Then came the chaos. Historical accounts describe groomsmen and bridesmaids chucking stockings at the newlyweds for luck, everyone hooting and hollering. Only after this loud spectacle could the pair retreat behind thick curtains for some quiet. But don't be fooled. Servants or courtiers often hovered close, ears perked for any tidbit to share. This wasn't just a private milestone. It was a public statement, ripe for castle gossip by morning. Now switch scenes to the peasants, and it's a whole other story. Their wedding night? Purely practical, often squeezed into a cramped reality. Old village records paint a picture of tiny huts, one room for everything, where your family might be snoring just steps away, or worse, livestock grunting in the corner. No curtains, no ceremonies, just thin walls if you were lucky. Unlike the drawn-out noble rituals, peasant couples often marked their union with a quick word of commitment. No fanfare needed. Intimacy was less about romance and more about getting it done amid the grind of daily survival. Privacy wasn't even a dream. You just hoped folks nearby minded their own business. Here's where the stakes really split. For the upper class, that night wasn't just personal, it was a contract. Historical notes stress that consummation made the marriage legit, especially when it tied powerful families together. Some accounts even mention witnesses lingering to verify the deed, which feels downright intrusive now. If it didn't happen, alliances for land or titles could crumble, risking the family's entire legacy. Every noble wedding night was a high-pressure move in a bigger political game, watched by far too many eyes. For peasants, though, the focus stayed small and real. Their unions didn't shift kingdoms or fortunes. Starting a family was important, sure, but it was about extra hands for the fields, not dynasties. Old texts describe a bare-bones approach. Say your vows before a few witnesses, maybe scrape together a modest meal, and call it done. No one was double-checking anything because, honestly, those in power didn't care about a farmer's bedroom. It was just another step in a hard, practical life. So, with such different beginnings to married life, you've got to wonder how those first moments set the tone for everything that followed. Did a public spectacle versus a quiet necessity shape their views on closeness or family? It's a stark contrast. Nobles tied to performance and proof, peasants grounded in raw need. And if that starting point varied so much, imagine how it played out when they first had to choose who to share that life with in the first place. Let's shift gears and talk about how medieval folks picked their partners, a decision that could shape their entire future. You'd think it was all about romance, but here's the kicker. Your wallet and your rank often mattered more than your heart. Whether you were a noble striking deals or a peasant looking for a helping hand, finding a spouse was a wildly different game depending on where you stood in society. Stick around, because the divide between the rich and the poor on this is massive, and the details are juicier than you'd expect. Here's what set the tone. If you were born into nobility, forget about choosing for yourself. Marriage was pure strategy. Land, power, and alliances were the name of the game. Your parents hashed out the match like they were bartering goods, not uniting souls. Meanwhile, in the muddy villages, peasants often had more freedom. They eyed someone who could toil beside them, whether it was hauling buckets or tending crops. Think about that. Your lifelong partner might be picked based on their knack for fixing a leaky roof, not some grand title or sprawling estate. That practical split defined how these two worlds approached the whole idea of marriage. Imagine a drafty stone hall in the 12th century, where noble parents huddle over parchment, sealing a marriage contract before their kids even meet. Historical records reveal that young lords and ladies often laid eyes on their future spouse only after everything was signed. No shy smiles or whispered promises, just a hard bargain between families. These matches weren't about feelings. They were chess moves to snag a better castle or a chunk of territory. It's wild to think how little personal choice mattered when a single vow could tip the balance of entire regions. Now, Picture the flip side in a bustling village. Old accounts show peasants mingling at market stalls or harvest dances, picking partners not for wealth, but for who could hold their own. Could they keep the hearth warm in a brutal winter? Could they patch a fence or herd the flock? That's what they cared about. They didn't have gold to squabble over, but survival was their currency. Shared work and trust. You can almost hear the chatter at those gatherings. Folks pairing up not because of some decree, but because of who clicked when the day's labor was done. Historical evidence hammers home how dowries dominated noble matches. Without a fat stack of land or coin, you weren't getting hitched. No exceptions. It wasn't a sweet gesture. It was a ticket to the deal, tying every bit of intimacy to family gain. If the dowry fell short, you stayed unwed, no matter how much you fancied someone. For nobles, marriage was less a bond and more a transaction, a way to hoard wealth and clout within the right circles. Saying yes was just signing on to build a legacy, stone by stone. Peasants kept it simpler, often just needing mutual agreement to seal the deal. No fancy documents or ceremonies if both said okay. Sure, they still weighed who could help weather a tough season. Survival always loomed large. But without titles or treasures in play, they had room to choose someone they meshed with. Village life meant you knew everyone's quirks already, so your pick often boiled down to who you'd rely on when times got rough. So, with status steering who you'd share your life with, it's worth asking how other factors shaped those personal connections. Where you lived, for instance, could twist the rules of attraction in ways you'd never guess. Let's turn to that next and see how your surroundings played a huge role in matters of the heart. Let's zero in on how your surroundings flipped the script on intimacy in medieval times. We're talking about the stark contrast between city lust and country life, where a few miles could mean a whole different set of rules for casual encounters and paid arrangements. You wouldn't believe how much your address shaped the way people got close, and the split between urban streets and rural fields is full of surprises worth unpacking. Here's the big divide that sets everything apart. In bustling cities like York, sex work wasn't hushed up or tucked away. It was out there, zoned, and tightly controlled. Old city records point to specific areas marked for the trade, with street names like Grape Lane giving a not-so-subtle hint at their purpose. The term grape tied back to grappling or sexual activity, so everyone knew what went down there. Town officials ran these spots with an iron grip, treating them almost like any other marketplace for goods. Out in the countryside, though, it was a different story. Things stayed under wraps, personal, and far less organized. No signs, no oversight, just quiet moments snatched in hidden corners. It's like comparing a loud tavern to a secret whisper in the forest. Picture yourself on a crowded city street, spotting sex workers with striped hoods or bells jingling, as seen in places like Vienna. Historical notes show these weren't just marks of shame. They became badges of their trade. Here's a fun fact. Some wealthy women even mimicked their edgy looks, turning these workers into unexpected style icons. It's crazy to think a job meant to be on the fringes could influence what the elite wore to their grand feasts. That kind of openness in city life shows just how accepted this could be when kept under official watch. Now imagine the rural side, deep in village territory. Old accounts suggest affairs and quick flings unfolded in barns or behind haystacks, any spot away from nosy neighbors. There were no designated zones or bold markers, just the constant threat of getting caught. Without any formal rules, gossip became the real enforcer. If someone heard about your field rendezvous, the whole village was buzzing by nightfall. Unlike the city's neat system, country hookups were a gamble, and a single slip could stick with you in a tight-knit place where everyone knew your business. Historical records dig deeper into this gap. In urban centers, leaders often saw brothels as a necessary evil, a way to curb bigger troubles. Some towns set up municipal brothels with strict guidelines on hours and pay, all to keep things in line. But in rural areas, control came from shame, not structure. Step out of bounds, and the church or your neighbors hit you with harsh looks or pointed preaching. There was no safety net, just the heavy weight of judgment bearing down. Here's another twist. Cities offered women in the trade a shot at a better life. Stories tell of rural women heading to town, finding financial freedom through sex work, a rare escape from field labor or kitchen drudgery. A handful of coins could change everything. In the countryside, though, a casual fling often spiraled into scandal or forced fixes, especially if a child came along. There was no way out when the village turned on you. So, with location drawing such sharp lines around casual intimacy, it raises questions about how people manage the outcomes of all this closeness. How did they handle what came after, when the stakes of family and future loomed large? Let's shift to that next and unpack another layer of this complex world. Let's turn our attention to how medieval folks handled the tricky business of family size. We're diving into family planning, and trust me, whether you were a noble with clever tricks up your sleeve or a peasant facing serious risks, your status decided everything. You might assume everyone struggled the same way with this, but the reality was far from equal. The gap between rich and poor shaped whether you had a strategy or were just hoping for the best, and the details are eye-opening. Here's what split the two worlds apart. Nobles had access to sneaky methods and knowledge to manage things, giving them a real shot at control. They weren't just crossing their fingers, they had actual tools to limit extra heirs if needed. Peasants, on the other hand, were stuck relying on shaky village rumors or pure luck, often with dangerous consequences. It's wild to think how a bit of wealth and education could tilt the odds so heavily when it came to building a family. This wasn't just about having kids. It was about securing power for the elite or simply surviving another day for the rest. Imagine a noblewoman in her quiet chamber, leafing through a worn medical text from the castle library. Historical accounts point to them using herbal mixes, stuff like rue or pennyroyal, or even vinegar suppositories to dodge unwanted pregnancies. Too many kids could split the family estate, and that was a nightmare for their wealth. Sure, these methods weren't a guarantee, but they offered a fighting chance to keep the inheritance neat. It's almost like they had a secret playbook, something the lower classes couldn't even imagine getting their hands on. Now picture a peasant couple huddled in a dark, smoky hut. No books, no fancy solutions here. Old church records, like penitential, talk about folks praying to saints for fertility when they wanted children, or turning to risky abortions when they couldn't cope with more. Think about whispering desperate hopes, or testing some sketchy brew a neighbor swore by, with no clue if it'd harm you. They had almost no control, just gambling with their health and future. That harsh uncertainty shows the brutal edge of their day-to-day life. Research highlights how literacy gave nobles a huge leg up. They could read manuscripts packed with health and medical tips, or pay someone who could, learning ways to avoid pregnancies or time and air just right. Peasants, though, were left with oral traditions, village lore, and old wives' tales that often did more damage than good. That knowledge gap wasn't a minor detail. It directly affected who survived, who didn't, and how families grew or shrank over time. Economic stakes widened this divide even more. Noble records show they often capped family size to protect their wealth. Fewer kids meant bigger shares for the chosen heirs. But for peasants, more children equaled more help in the fields, even if feeding them was a stretch. Village accounts often list large families despite the struggle, because every kid was a future worker. Survival pushed them to keep going, no matter how thin resources got. So, with family planning tied so tightly to what you could access or afford, it's clear that personal choices were never really just personal. They reflected a bigger system of haves and have-nots, where even the most private matters carried the weight of your place in the world. Let's pull all these threads together and see what they reveal about the true nature of life back then. So, let's wrap this up with a final look at medieval intimacy. Here's the real takeaway. Sex back then wasn't just spicier than you imagined. It was a brutal reflection of wealth and rank. Your place in society decides every private moment, from castle beds to cottage floors. If this flipped your view, smash that like button and tell us. Would you pick a noble's grand wedding night or a peasant's quiet one? Comment below. Let's keep digging into history's raw truths, together with one last thought. Your status didn't just shape love, it defined your entire world.